wars used to bankrupt nations. But in the 20th century, America found a way to profit, transforming debt, industry, and war itself into a system so lucrative it would anchor the global economy. By 1919, U.S. banks held more of the world's gold than any country in history. The world's most costly conflicts became engines of wealth and power. But how was war turned into a business, and at what price? The answer begins a century ago, with a deal that rewrote the rules of money and statecraft. In 1915, as Europe's battlefields devoured men and material, New York's financial district became the unlikely engine room of the Allied war effort. J.P. Morgan and Company, acting as Britain's official purchasing agent, orchestrated a flow of American goods and credit that would soon reshape the global financial order. The Morgan Syndicate arranged billions of dollars in loans for Britain and France, including a landmark $500 million Anglo-French bond, then the largest foreign loan in United States history. These private credits, backed by gold shipments and securities, allowed the Allies to buy steel, wheat, and munitions on a scale never seen before, even as the United States government maintained a stance of neutrality. Behind the scenes, Morgan partners weighed both risk and reward. They argued that Allied credit was sound, and that the prosperity of American industry depended on keeping the orders coming. Their calculations paid off. By 1917, America had flipped from debtor to creditor, with Wall Street's ledgers swelling as Europe's gold reserves flowed west. Once the United States entered the war, the Treasury turned to the public, launching 4 Liberty Loan drives and a post-war victory loan. These campaigns blanketed the country with posters, parades, and speeches, urging citizens to buy a stake in victory. More than 20 million Americans subscribed, raising nearly $20 billion, about 2/3 of the war's total cost. Banks, post offices, and volunteer committees worked together to make bond ownership a civic duty, embedding federal debt in the savings of ordinary families and institutions alike. By the armistice, the United States stood as the world's foremost creditor, its financial power secured not just by gold, but by the savings and trust of its own people. In July 1944, delegates from 44 nations gathered in the small town of Bretton Woods, New Hampshire. The world was still at war, but the United States arrived as both the largest creditor and the only country with its gold reserves intact, holding about 2/3 of the world's official gold. American officials, led by Treasury economist Harry Dexter White, pushed for a new monetary order that would formalize the financial dominance gained through 2 global conflicts. Across the table, John Maynard Keynes argued for a more balanced system, but the realities of gold and credit weighed heavily in every negotiation. The conference produced a framework that would define the post-war era. Every country agreed to fix its currency to the United States dollar, while the dollar itself would be convertible to gold at $35 an ounce. This arrangement made the dollar the anchor of international trade and finance, turning United States Treasury liabilities into the world's primary reserve asset. To manage the system and provide stability, the conference established the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, institutions designed to oversee exchange rates, aid reconstruction, and handle crises. The decisions at Bretton Woods locked in United States monetary primacy. With most of the world's gold in American vaults and the dollar pegged to a fixed value, the United States gained the power to shape global finance on its own terms. What began as a series of wartime financial advantages became the formal rules of the world economy, setting the stage for decades of dollar-driven growth and conflict. Factories that once turned out refrigerators and cars began producing tanks, bombers, and ammunition almost overnight. In 1942, President Roosevelt appointed Donald Nelson, a former Sears executive, to lead the War Production Board. Nelson's team wielded sweeping powers. They halted civilian auto production, rationed steel and rubber, and issued priority contracts to giants like Ford, General Motors, Boeing, and DuPont. The government promised to cover all costs, plus a fixed profit through cost-plus contracts. This model removed the financial risk for corporations, ensuring that every rivet and bolt would be paid for, no matter the final bill. The scale was staggering. By 1944, military spending soared to over 35% of the entire U.S. economy. Civilian plants were gutted and rebuilt for war, churning out more than 300,000 aircraft and 88,000 tanks in just a few years. The War Production Board coordinated every step, from raw material allocation to finished goods delivery, establishing a template for federal procurement that would outlast the conflict. To pay for this transformation, the Treasury launched a series of war loan drives. Over 85 million Americans bought bonds through payroll deductions, banks, or post offices, turning savings into rifles and ships. Victory bonds financed nearly half the war's cost. By 1946, federal debt had ballooned to the equivalent of the entire U.S. GDP, a level never seen before. The partnership between government and industry, backed by mass public finance, created an arsenal that not only won the war, but also set the foundation for a permanent military-industrial economy. Dwight Eisenhower left office in January 1961 with a warning that echoed across generations: that the rise of a permanent arms industry entwined with government could threaten both liberty and democracy. His words came after years in which defense spending had become a fixed feature of American life. Through the 1950s and the early 1960s, military budgets rarely dipped below 8% of the entire U.S. economy, even in peacetime. Factories, research labs, and military bases spread across the country, anchoring jobs and local economies to federal contracts. The creation of DARPA in 1958 signaled a new era of constant technological competition as the government poured money into advanced research, satellites, missiles, computers, often through private contractors and universities. These investments were not temporary wartime measures, but ongoing commitments that shaped the industrial and scientific landscape for decades. As the Vietnam War escalated in the mid-1960s, the financial burden intensified. Washington spent between $111 billion and $168 billion on the conflict, a figure that layered directly on top of already high Cold War baselines. Yet, taxes did not rise to match the new outlays. Instead, the government ran persistent deficits, borrowing to fund both military operations abroad and social programs at home. The result was a surge in inflation. Consumer prices, which had been stable at around 1 to 2% a year in the early 1960s, soared past 5% by 1969. The pressure on the dollar mounted as foreign governments and central banks began to question whether the U.S. could continue to back its currency with gold. The economic stress of fighting a distant war while sustaining a global military presence and an ambitious domestic agenda pushed the system to its breaking point. On August 15, 1971, Richard Nixon addressed the nation and announced the suspension of the dollar's convertibility into gold. This move, known as the closing of the gold window, ended the Bretton Woods system and untethered the dollar from any fixed backing. In the years that followed, the global economy faced a new shock. Oil prices quadrupled after the 1973 OPEC embargo, flooding oil exporting nations with U.S. dollars. Behind closed doors, Treasury Secretary William Simon and other officials negotiated with Saudi Arabia in 1974 to ensure that oil would remain priced exclusively in dollars. In return, Saudi oil profits were steered into U.S. Treasury bonds and American banks. This arrangement created a new anchor for global liquidity, a steady, energy-driven demand for dollars that allowed the U.S. to finance persistent deficits without the discipline of gold. The petrodollar cycle became the backbone of America's financial reach. LOGCAP III rewrote the rules of war contracting, assigning nearly $40 billion to Halliburton's KBR for logistics in Iraq and Afghanistan. Auditors flagged over $1 billion in unsupported or questionable costs, fuel overcharges, inflated meal counts, and missing equipment, yet the flow of payments rarely paused. The cost-plus structure meant the government absorbed overruns while private firms collected steady fees, echoing the risk-free profits of earlier wartime contracts. As congressional hearings scrutinized KBR executives, the logic extended beyond the battlefield. In 2008, the Federal Reserve's balance sheet swelled from under $1 trillion to $4.5 trillion, and by the end of 2020, it surpassed $7 trillion. Trillions of dollars in public funds stabilized banks and markets, just as billions of dollars had sustained contractors abroad. The same mechanisms, open-ended commitments, deficit spending, and public guarantees, now operate as a default response to crisis, embedding the profit engine of war deep within the architecture of the modern economy. Today, military spending shapes both markets and policy. Defense contracts alone topped $400 billion last year. As crises blur the line between war and peace, the machinery built for conflict now underpins the global economy. The real cost is measured not just in dollars, but in the priorities we accept.